All right, good afternoon, everybody. We have our second of three webinars today. Today, Catherine Min with the South Carolina Office of Resilience is with us. You probably have seen Catherine at our RBC meetings. I think she's attended pretty much all of them. Catherine is the Santee Basin coordinator for the Office of Resilience. Today, she's going to talk about the statewide resilience and risk reduction plan. Her presentation is probably going to be, 30, 35 minutes or so. And then I want to review some of the recommendations that came out of the resilience plan. Some of them pertain directly to work that we're doing and are similar or nearly identical to some of the recommendations that other RBCs have been making as part of their deliberations. So I want to spend a little bit of time to review those recommendations, and that'll set us up for when we start to develop our own recommendations, which we may do at the next meeting, the April meeting, as they relate to drought. Later on in the summer, we'll be talking about other recommendations, and that's where we'll see some synergies and some similarities with some of the recommendations that are in the resilience plan. But with that, I think I'll go ahead and turn it over to Catherine. Catherine, you ready?
Yes, thanks so much, John, for the introduction. And it's good to see all of you online today. And for those who are going to watch this later, hello. I'm excited to chat with you today about the statewide strategic resilience and risk reduction plan. And like John said, to note some of the similarities where actions that are taken to mitigate flooding, which is the primary purpose of the strategic statewide risk and resilience plan, where those intersect with planning for, water scarcity or drought conditions. So today, I'd like to first introduce SCORE and the concept of resilience. I'll then describe our, the background and planning process behind our statewide plan. And then I would like to share with you some key takeaways and recommendations related to resilience that are relevant to y'all in drought and this general planning process. So to start off, I wanted to introduce our office. Since you may not have heard of us, we're a newer state agency, and we were developed in our first form after the 2015 floods. So many of us remember the 2015 floods. The South Carolina Disaster Recovery Office was created to deal with the recovery effort and to take in, the funds that would help rebuild and repair homes. And in the 2015 flood recovery effort, we realized that the previous storm of record really was Hurricane Hugo, and a lot of the institutional knowledge related to disaster recovery had been lost in those intervening years. So at that time, Governor Haley created the South Carolina Disaster Recovery Office, and that office persisted through our three back-to-back disasters of the floods, Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Florence, which you all probably remember well. And throughout that time, the office, did the rebuilding of houses across the state. And in 2018, Governor McMaster said, hey, we've had three back-to-back disasters that have caused significant loss of life and property in South Carolina. What can we do to be a little bit more proactive and kind of get ahead of these disasters rather than just waiting and recovering on the back end? So he created the South Carolina Floodwater Commission with some experts, practitioners across the state. And they studied the issue, and out of that commission came several recommendations, including one, to create the Office of Resilience as it is now, which absorbed the South Carolina Disaster Recovery Office and also added some other sections that we'll talk about in the next slide. And then the other recommendation was for that office to create South Carolina's first statewide resilience plan to guide state investment in resilience activities that would work to prevent flooding across the state, as well as address other hazards, but the primary focus is flooding. So that's kind of the background of SCORE and how we came to be. And we just officially started operations in 2021 in our present form, including, the Resilience Planning Division and other parts of our office. So the mission of the South Carolina Office of Resilience is to lessen the impact of disasters on the communities and citizens of South Carolina by planning and coordinating statewide resilience, long-term recovery, and hazard mitigation. And everything that we do at our office falls into these three buckets. First, with disaster recovery, as I already mentioned, we rebuild and replace homes that are damaged by flooding. using HUD CDBG DR funds. That's a big part of our office. And part of that that we're really proud of is our disaster case management program, where after a major disaster, we hire case managers who really walk disaster survivors through every step of the housing recovery process. And this is really important because after maybe the most stressful event of someone's life, they're able to have someone that's with them, helping them, understand what's happening with their home, with contractors coming in and out, stuff like that. And one part of this program that has actually received national recognition is that our case managers not only help with the housing recovery that happens through our office, but they also connect disaster survivors with other resources, whether they're statewide or federal, to meet their other unmet needs. So whether that's maybe childcare, clothing, food, mental health support, there are lots of resources that our disaster case managers connect survivors with, and that is a really important part of our office. The next bucket is mitigation. At our office, we do plans and studies to help lower capacity communities with their hazard mitigation plans, stormwater plans, other things like that. We also have an infrastructure program where we implement traditional gray infrastructure or some nature-based solutions, some green infrastructure in communities across the state to mitigate flooding. We also have a buyout program. This is completely voluntary. This is where we offer to buy out families who are in repetitive loss zones so that they are able to move out of harm's way, and then their house is demolished and that property is turned into green space for perpetuity, which one, as I said, removes the family out of harm's way, which is really powerful, but also helps that space mitigate flooding by allowing it to absorb floodwaters as well. So that's a really impactful program that we have. And then the mitigation department also offers match grants for other federal grants. And then finally, we have the resilience planning department. That's where I work. This department was responsible for the development and now the implementation of the strategic statewide resilience and risk reduction plan. And we also do watershed-based regional resilience planning, which is what, I specifically am a watershed coordinator. So as you can see on this chart on the right, SCORE works in the recovery and mitigation parts of the disaster cycle. I wanted to make it clear that we are not EMD. We do work closely with EMD, but they are responsible more for the immediate response to disasters. So that's just a snapshot of what SCORE does. And you may be wondering, we're talking about the South Carolina Office of Resilience, but what really is resilience? Because that word has definitely been thrown around a lot these days. And we were wrestling with that when the office was first created. So with a panel of, academics, experts, practitioners, and others, we landed on this definition of resilience. So SCORE defines resilience as the ability of communities, economies, and ecosystems to anticipate, absorb, recover, and then thrive when they're presented with environmental change and natural hazards. So we really do take this all-encompassing definition of resilience pretty seriously. And we really try to consider with every program that we have, how are we impacting communities, economies, and ecosystems, ultimately hoping to support them to where they can thrive, even when they're presented with shocks like natural hazards or longer-term stressors like environmental change. So the statewide resilience plan was published in June of 2023, and when it was being developed, it relied on several key planning principles throughout the process. So first was the use of high quality data to assess risk and vulnerability, and then we wanted to make that data accessible to localities so that when, counties or cities or other jurisdictions are doing their own resilience planning, they have access to the highest quality data possible. We wanted to make sure we were coordinating at the federal, state, regional, and local levels. We wanted to always prioritize recognizing the beneficial function of natural systems for floodwater conveyance and storage. We wanted to develop solutions based on watershed boundaries, not just jurisdictional boundaries. You all are very familiar with this concept due to the RBC planning process, but we know that water doesn't just flow within a county or, within a city jurisdiction, but we have to look to the entire watershed to really understand what's happening and where those leverage points are. And then finally, we always want to, wherever possible, recommend strategies with many co-benefits beyond flood mitigation. And again, we're looking at communities, economies, and ecosystems. So maybe some strategies have benefits for recreation or aesthetics or habitat or biodiversity or carbon sequestration. We want to prioritize all of these solutions rather than just turning to maybe gray infrastructure that only conveys, stormwater or something like that. And when we were developing the plan, we looked at many different planning conditions to consider different facets of risk and vulnerability. So of course, when we were making this plan, we looked at soil type and land cover, since those directly influence flooding. But we also looked at, risk, like who and what is being impacted by flooding. So we looked at population projections, infrastructure, whether that's roadways or hazardous waste facilities or hospitals. We looked at all of those. And then also where flooding exposure intersects with social vulnerability. And this planning process resulted in this resilience plan. I encourage you to check it out. I know John sent it out last week, I think. It is hundreds of pages of long, so it is quite the endeavor to take a look at if you want to. But I think a lot of these chapters are very interesting and would be helpful to this group. Particularly chapter 6, we do touch on drought as another hazard. It's pretty surface level. But also what I hope you see through this presentation is that many of the recommendations that are relevant to flooding are also relevant to drought. We're all about, allowing water to recharge into the groundwater, slowing it down, keeping it locally instead of just expediting water straight to the ocean. So anyway, I think a lot of these chapters will be relevant to you. But in general, the plan identifies major flood risks around the state and potential losses that could occur as a result of extreme weather events. It seeks to guide state investment in resilience and specifically in flood mitigation. And then the plan also provides strategies for local governments to implement resilience in their communities in order to mitigate potential flood risks. So I did want to provide just some quick background on flood risk so that when you do dive into the plan, you have a background for what we were considering. I know this is probably relevant or probably very familiar to many of you, especially based on where you live. And then really quickly, since we are focusing on flood risk, I wanted to share just why we do this. In the South Carolina laws where the office was established that I mentioned earlier, we are told through the legislation to focus on flood mitigation for the most part. If you see under Part B, we do mention flooding, wildfires, and drought conditions as well, but the focus definitely is on flood mitigation. So that's why the office kind of operates in the way that it does. So I'm sure this is not new information to any of you, but flooding in South Carolina is caused by prolonged rain events, short intense rain events, overflowing rivers, sometimes dam or levee failures, which we saw in 2015, storm surge, tidal processes, or a combination of all of these. And then if you'll recall from Hope's presentation to the RBC, we do know that South Carolina's precipitation really varies significantly on a yearly and decadal basis. So we see different conditions related to flooding all throughout time in South Carolina. And many of you may be familiar with the FEMA special hazard or special flood hazard areas. These are sometimes referred to as the 100-year floodplain or the 1% annual chance flood hazard areas. You can see these here in this really rich purple color on the map. And when we talk about the 1% annual chance flood hazard, this is kind of the standard risky area as denoted by FEMA. So if you live in an NFIP community and you have a federally backed mortgage, you are required to buy flood insurance if you live in a special flood hazard area. But sometimes I think this can kind of skew people's perception of risk, calling it a 100-year floodplain. That's why FEMA is trying to get away from that language right now. But if you have a 30-year mortgage, you do have a 26% chance of flooding throughout the time of your mortgage if you live in a 100-year floodplain. But beyond that kind of people's perception of risk being potentially inaccurate within, the SFHA, let me advance this slide. We know that flood risk also exists outside of the FEMA designated SFHA. So while that map is informative, it doesn't provide, a full picture of flood risk in communities. And we've actually seen that 40% of flood insurance claims occur outside of the SFHA. So other flood models can be really helpful too in helping, localities, communities, individual homeowners, property owners identify their flood risk. So First Street Foundation, I'll speak about this more in a little while, but this is a flood model that we use at SCORE a lot. And they actually identify 1.7 times the amount of properties as having substantial flood risk compared with the FEMA SFHA designation. So if you were just to rely on SFHAs and those maps, you would have somewhat of a limited picture of flood risk. And you can see this in South Carolina. I zoomed in on the map. So in the coastal area, it's pretty similar between the First Street Foundation flood model and the FEMA SFHA as to the number of properties who are denoted as having significant flood risk. But as we go into the upstate, there are some counties with, 7, 8 times more flood prone properties than are identified in the FEMA SFHA. So I just wanted to note that this is really important to people's understanding of risk and people, thinking about actions they might take to protect their property and their families, whether that's, purchasing flood insurance, taking mitigation measures, etc. So the First Street Foundation flood model is a nationwide probabilistic flood model, which shows the risk of flooding in any location due to rainfall, riverine flooding, and coastal surge flooding. And this was developed by a lot of scientists and experts, and it has a pretty fine spatial resolution, all things considered. It's a 3-meter spatial resolution. And the neat thing about this is that it has consistent methodology across the whole country. So you can, apples to apples, compare parcel level risk for flooding across the country. And the other unique part about this flood model, which we use in our resilience plan and also in a lot of our other planning efforts, is that flood risk is considered now and 30 years into the future. And they do that by applying global climate model projections to forecast flood risk. So this gets at what Hope and other RBC members have talked about with considering the non-stationarity of projections. Like if we only rely on current conditions or past historical conditions, we might have an inaccurate or potentially underestimate the risk of flooding in the future. So here's a map, kind of like I showed you the FEMA SFHA map. This is a map of First Street Foundation's flooding. This is for a 100-year storm event, and you can see inundation levels 6 inches to 3 feet or above across Charleston. So this is really interesting, and I'll show you a tool at the very end of my presentation where you can take a look at this if you're interested in an interactive format. And something I just wanted to point out, I love looking at Zillow. I don't know about you guys. My husband and I are actually trying to buy a house right now, so I'm always on Zillow. But I just pulled up a home in the Wagner Terrace area because I wanted to show you that on Zillow and other house buying platforms right now, First Street Foundation data actually has been integrated into them, so potential home buyers have a better understanding of their risk. And I highlight this because this is one of the central recommendations of our resilience plan, and I just think it's good for all of us to know if you or someone you know is buying a house. But if you scroll down in Zillow to this kind of bar where it says climate risks, you can see the flood factor score. And this property is severely at risk. It has a 7 out of 10 score for flooding climate risk. And then if you click on that box, you can see your potential home you're thinking about buying in the First Street Foundation map. So you can see, with the legend on the side too, the depth of flooding that you would expect to experience in a 100-year storm event. So I know this isn't extremely relevant to the RBC, but I just wanted to point it out because I think it's really helpful in general. And of course, at SCORE, we think, more awareness about flood risk is important for everyone to have. So I wanted to point this out while I have y'all as a captive audience. And again, y'all probably have seen this personally or in your community before, but the reason we talk about flood risk so much is because even a little bit of water can cause significant damage. About 6 inches of water, we have drywall, insulation, wallpaper, floor, appliance damage. If we get flooding over 1 foot, we have damage to electrical outlets and HVAC systems, and cars can float. If we have greater than 2 inches of flooding, we see that large appliances and trucks can float, and greater than 6 feet, we're assuming total loss. And based off First Street Foundation data, there are a significant number of parcels across South Carolina that would be potentially inundated in a 100-year storm event to these different levels of flooding. So I won't, go through all of this, but it is pretty impactful when you think about families and homes across our state. And when we think about flood, of course, for many of us, residential properties are what come to mind first. But of course, we're also thinking about commercial properties, critical infrastructure like our transportation systems, our hospitals, our doctors' offices, Again, like I talked about, waste facilities or hazardous waste facilities. In this part of our state, we're also looking at cultural resources and all of these things that make our state the way it is. So when we think about flood, just like when we think about drought and these other issues, we're kind of looking at this all-encompassing, we're looking through an all-encompassing lens of, what would disruptions and all of these lifelines and critical infrastructure mean for us, in our personal life, professionally, all those different ways. And then I did want to note that our office, we are considering changing conditions. We talked about South Carolina's precipitation varying greatly on a yearly and decadal basis. We know, like Hope was saying, that there aren't too many statistically significant long-term trends to speak about, but we think, based on current estimates of rainfall intensity and duration and frequency, that may not be enough to provide accurate projections going forward. That may underestimate the likelihood of future damaging rain events. But what we do know in South Carolina is that we have had extremely rapid population growth and development. And this has increased the amount of impervious surfaces throughout our state, which of course influence flood risk because water has fewer places to naturally infiltrate into the ground, and it picks up speed as it goes across impervious surfaces. So we know there are a lot of changing conditions, whether that's related to just growth and development or to precipitation, that we need to be aware of as we're considering flood risk. And this is relevant also, of course, to considering lack of water and drought as well. I think in a lot of ways, they're two sides of the same coin. So now this is probably the heart of the presentation here. I wanted to present some recommendations from our statewide resilience plan that I thought are beneficial to mitigating flooding and also drought conditions. And then I also have some, like 1 or 2 slides prepared about some recommendations that are just beneficial to flooding if anyone's interested in that after the presentation. So feel free to let me know. So the first recommendation that I selected for the group was the recommendation to prioritize green infrastructure and low impact development. So on the flooding side, green infrastructure reduces or delays peak flows. And then for flooding and also for drought, we like that green infrastructure can stimulate infiltration into the groundwater. So whenever we have things like bioswales that allow water to convey through vegetation down a slope, or rain gardens that capture water and hold it to allow it to infiltrate, we're promoting and enhancing systems sponge function. So instead of just having a pipe or something that conveys water really quickly from one destination to another without allowing it to infiltrate, we're trying to slow water down and allow it to infiltrate into the groundwater. And the cool thing about green infrastructure and low impact development is that it often comes with a lot of positive co-benefits. So we see that it can help build habitat, so it can help improve or maintain biodiversity. That also influences and strengthens ecosystem services. A lot of times, green infrastructure improves water quality because the vegetation captures pollutants before it goes on to its next destination as well. And many people would say that green infrastructure also improves a community's aesthetics. So those are some co-benefits of green infrastructure and low impact development. Another mutually beneficial recommendation is land conservation, because whenever we're able to maintain natural systems, we allow them to have stormwater infiltrate and recharge groundwater and keep water right where it is. So SCORE has been working on that, and the primary vehicle is through conserving properties based off this prioritization map. So we have our map that the Conservation Bank also uses, and it prioritizes lands for conservation based off where floodwaters are expected and also where land cover and soils can best absorb floodwaters. So since 2022, SCORE has conserved over 12,000 acres across 7 counties. And again, this provides many co-benefits. Some of them, like the previous slide, can improve or maintain biodiversity and protect important ecosystem services. But also, depending on how these lands are used and how they're conserved, they can provide opportunities for recreation, for carbon sequestration. Of course, they are important to the character of our state. I think the governor has very ambitious plans related to conservation that he just announced a few weeks ago. So land conservation is a big recommendation and a central one that SCORE has already been working to implement. Some other recommendations that are relevant to the RBC and also to flood mitigation are related to improving data collection and coordination. So there's a recommendation to increase the density of weather stations. You can see one in a picture here, and also river gauges to assess, rainfall and also river height. So right now, SCORE is working to implement this by working with Clemson and their Intelligent Rivers program to install low-cost sensors in watersheds in the upstate to enhance monitoring efforts. So these sensors also feed into different work on flood models and can help validate or improve flood models as well. So this is really exciting, and we're looking forward to seeing how that program and project develops. Other ways that SCORE is trying to improve data collection and coordination are through obtaining NOAA Atlas 14 and 15 rainfall data. This is important because it is supposed to account for future non-stationarity and use climate projections to look at rainfall curves. And this is important, of course, to RBC planning and trying to think about water planning in the future. And it's also important for our recommendation that whenever infrastructure is being designed or repaired, it should consider future conditions for the projected lifespan of the infrastructure. So when we're thinking about building a bridge or a sidewalk or anything like that, it should be resilient not only to flood conditions and rainfall events now, but also for the entire projected life. So maybe 40, 50 years into the future. So we think when we obtain these NOAA data, it will be really impactful for infrastructure planning, water planning, everything like that. And we are currently making moves on that and trying to acquire funding sources to get that data set. And then finally, for data, we are looking to obtain higher resolution population projections at a finer scale than just the county level. So looking at growth, movement, or decline of populations, because of course this can inform water demand models, land use development pressure. It can help us prioritize which lands we should seek to conserve. This would help a lot of different efforts throughout the state, and SCORE is working on that. Another recommendation of our plan is that resilience should be incorporated in other planning efforts and other regulatory processes. So one specific recommendation that I think y'all will see looks very familiar is that water systems should update drought response plans to prepare for future conditions. So I know y'all have heard that over and over, but I guess now you're hearing it again from another source. That's one specific recommendation for drought. But then more broadly, too, we really strongly feel that all planning efforts should be aligned for these priorities. So when we're looking at comprehensive plans, zoning and land use plans, subdivision regulations, floodplain management, all these other efforts, they should be aligned and include resilient policies. For example, with zoning, we don't want to go ahead and put people into harm's way. We want to make sure development is occurring on less risky plans related to zoning so that we don't have to take these mitigation strategies or other remediation efforts on the back end. So that's just one example of the importance of, planning for resilience on the front end. And then I did want to share my job area right now, the watershed-based resilience planning effort. I know this can be a little bit confusing because we have our river basin planning that's happening through DES and formerly through DNR, but SCORE also has its watershed-based resilience planning program. And we are trying to work with communities in the watersheds of South Carolina to mitigate flooding by first getting community-informed risk and vulnerability assessments to see where flooding is occurring on the ground, and then working with communities to identify and prioritize locally aware solutions for flooding. So our goal is that by the end of 2026, we will have watershed-based resilience plans for each of the river basins in South Carolina. And the whole goal is that these will be coordinated across each watershed, so we're trying to minimize negative upstream and downstream impacts of any actions that are taken to mitigate flooding within the watershed. And then finally, a key part of this program is that we're seeking to link communities with funding, technical assistance, and other resources that can enable implementation. So we know there's a lot of work to be done to mitigate flooding across the state. We want to get those actions going. We don't want just another plan that's going to sit on a shelf. So we're trying to connect communities with resources, whether it's statewide, federal, other resources to get these projects going. And then I just wanted to share that on our website, I think John sent this out as well. You can see our 2024 update. So you can see more in depth about the recommendations that we have made progress on. This really has fallen mostly into data collection and coordination, watershed-based resilience planning, conservation, and then finding funding and bringing funding into the state of South Carolina related to resilience. But I encourage you to check that out. It's only a few pages long, and it can provide some more context about what our office is up to. And then this is my last slide. If you're curious about these resources or about flooding and how it might impact your community, I'd really encourage you to check out SCORE's Resilience Atlas. This is our online mapping tool where you can layer on hazard layers. Like here, I've turned on the FEMA flood hazard area, but you can also access First Street data, which I told you about, which is really cool. But you can turn on hazard layers, and then you can turn on land use layers. So we have lands that are conserved, we have wetlands, we have other protected lands. You can see that. And then you can also see infrastructure and other critical lifelines. So here I've turned on pharmacies. So you can see some pharmacies that are at risk of flooding based off the SFHAs, but also we have so many layers from fire stations to funeral homes to waste facilities. We just have so many different layers. So I'd encourage you to check it out. And if this is something that you're interested in for yourself or your jurisdiction or where you work, feel free to shoot me an email to reach out if you can't quite figure out the mapping tool. It can be a little bit complicated at the beginning, but once someone walks you through it, it's not hard. But I don't want you to just suffer through it if you don't have to. So feel free to shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to hop on a video call with you and go through how to use the Atlas. And I think it could be really beneficial. So that's all I have for you right now. I'm happy to answer any questions now, or if people are watching this later, you can feel free to email me at any time. And I'll be happy to answer any questions. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Catherine. Any questions from RBC members or other attendees? Well, if there are no questions, I wanted to share my screen and just highlight a couple additional recommendations that I thought were important to the River Basin planning effort that Catherine highlighted, I think, the most important ones, and she did a great job at it. There was a couple additional ones that I want to bring to your attention now, and then probably in a couple months from now when we start developing our own recommendations. I'm sharing kind of the executive summary of the recommendations. So they've got all of them listed underneath different categories. And the first category is improved data collection and coordination. And where you see a red box is where I've highlighted ones that I think may be of interest to the RBCs. In fact, we've kind of gone through this list in some of the other RBCs already. And in many instances, they developed similar, if not nearly identical recommendations. And I think why that's important is if you see the same recommendations showing up in multiple plans, resilience plan, and in different RBC plans, and I think that, suggests that, all right, a lot of different stakeholders see this as important. Hopefully that'll add momentum to implementing those recommendations. The first three, I think I highlighted here in the red box, Catherine already covered. More river gauges, increase the density of weather stations, coordinating data collection a little better. There's another one down here about establishing a group to evaluate climate information and how future climate trends will impact the state. A number of RBCs have made recommendations about looking at how future climate projections may impact supply availability. There's one about partnering with NOAA to look at hydrological footprint of South Carolina. This final one here is about sediment. Several of the RBCs have identified sedimentation of reservoirs as important and have identified a number of recommendations to further study the impact of sedimentation and how that impacts water storage. So I think that's an important one. There's one about establishing a technical advisory group to inventory existing models and capabilities and identify data gaps, make recommendations about additional modeling. Catherine mentioned the one about higher resolution population projections that obviously may benefit the river basin planning process by helping with additional detail in our demand projections. And then inventory and analyze zoning and land use policy statewide to understand how local jurisdictions implement zoning and how land use regulations shape communities' development and resilience. That's been a discussion point in several of the RBCs, and they've developed recommendations to encourage more thought, I guess, put into zoning and land use by counties and cities and towns. Under the category of coordinate watershed-based resilience planning and projects, I like this one here because many of the RBCs have come up with a similar one about funding implementation. So, we're going to be developing a plan, we're going to have recommendations, we're going to identify potential water management strategies, but all of that is contingent upon, or is likely contingent upon funding to be able to implement those recommendations and strategies. So many of the RBCs have developed a similar recommendation as this one that's focused on implementing the River Basin Plan strategies and recommendations. There's a number of them in this planning, land use, and other regulatory processes category that have similarities with some of the recommendations the RBCs have developed already, such as identifying BMPs. Water systems should conduct a resilience review of their water systems based on climate and flood risks. The Lower Savannah Salkehatchie RBC has been talking about this one lately. New legislation to be established to regulate the alteration of isolated wetland systems to reduce potential loss of flood mitigation and ecosystem services. They've been talking about that in the context of the EPA versus Sackett decision that was through the Supreme Court several years ago, and how that has impact on the ability to potentially develop these isolated wetland systems, which if development occurs in these isolated wetland systems, then that's limiting your ability for flood mitigation and other ecosystem services. So that's one we may want to talk about when we get into recommendations. In the incorporate resilience into infrastructure design category, there's one about consider future conditions and design of critical infrastructure. I think that's important. Here's one about removing barriers to permitting nature-based solutions on the state and local level. Catherine showed us a number of nature-based solutions that both mitigate flooding and enhance infiltration. I think the Saluda RBC has developed a recommendation that encourages local jurisdictions to implement nature-based solutions. And I think that generally covers a lot of the similar recommendations or recommendations I think the RBC may be interested in. Here's a final one, or a couple here, about funding sources. So we will probably revisit these when we really start diving into developing our recommendations. And if you feel that there's recommendations that are similar to these or that spur some ideas, then that'll be useful to our process. All right. Any questions? I see John has his hand up. John, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, yeah, I was just kind of curious, since land development planning has come up a couple times. I wondered the proportion of the basin where you don't have zoning in unincorporated parts of the county. I mean, are there counties in the basin that don't have zoning rules?
Yeah, good question. I don't know that I could answer that. Catherine, I don't know if SCORE has looked at that at all or has any idea.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I would have to ask around, but that is a great question and one that we're interested in. We're actually pursuing a project called a zoning atlas with this group that would compile different zoning regulations across the whole state and try to make one central map so that, where one county or jurisdiction says this is single family housing, but everyone has a different code for it. We would try to get a standardized zoning map for the entire state of South Carolina so that planners can see that at, a statewide scale. So great question. We're kind of working on that. But if you have a question about a specific county or collection of counties, I'm happy to look into it for you.
Okay, thanks.
That same similar question has come up with the Upper Savannah RBC. They've pointed out the fact that there's not a lot of zoning up in the upstate basins of their area, which is potentially a concern to them for being able to make change and implement some of their recommendations. So they've recognized it as well. Any other questions? All right, well, seeing none, I want to thank Catherine again for taking time today to present to us. If you do have any questions for Catherine, please take her up on her offer and reach out to her, or you can send it through me if you'd like. I'm sure Catherine will continue to probably attend our RBC meeting, so you can hold your question until the next meeting and ask her then. But Catherine, I appreciate your presentation today and all the information you provided.
Well, thanks, everyone. It's good to see you. I'll have to miss the next RBC meeting, but I'll be at the following one. So yeah, please feel free to shoot me an email if anything comes up or if you have any questions or ideas or suggestions. So thank you. It's good to see everyone today.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. And just as a reminder, I think our final scheduled webinar is next Monday, I believe. Grace, tell me if that's not right, but I think it's next Monday, correct?
Double checking now. Yes, it is.
Yep, and that's going to be Steve Meyer with DNR and Joey Ballinger with DNR. They'll be talking about both coastal marine resources and freshwater aquatic resources. So they generally have a lot of good information. That one will probably easily go about an hour. So look forward to that one as well. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your attendance today. I will see you all next Monday and then the following week for our RBC meeting. So take care.
Thanks, Catherine. Appreciate it, John.
Thank you.